Howdy y'all, I am Ice Gold, and we're doing yet another tier list, and I know that the update dropped like this morning, literal hours ago, but I still wanted to do this PvP matchups tier list, and I'm gonna try and do it to, just the best of my ability with just sort of where things are at in the meta. It's like I don't really think much is going to change considering the fabled drain nerf that we were promised is not coming for at least another little while. And then there's also some other cards that have gotten banned, that type of deal. There's some new lore spells, and that can really influence some of these. So just for now though, I am going to just go ahead and make this tier list. So as you can see here, or I should mention, all of these little icons, these dual school icons, were made by @DeckofFlora on Tumblr and on Twitter as well. So if you wanted to find out just where you can get some of these, she is the one that made these. So big shout outs to her. She sent me her page where I got to download all of these in actual good quality because she has just a bunch of emojis that you've probably seen around. But for the time being, let me just explain the tiers. So just because of like the like how these little emojis or whatever are designed, I couldn't really make just like an actual toss-up tier, but I do think that we're at a point where every matchup does favor at least one school by like even just a tiny margin. So just to go over things, if you didn't watch my Ice 25 Ice Games video last Friday, I sort of explained that, but basically a tilt victory, the top school is barely favored to win. A lean victory is the matchup just leans slightly in favor of the top school. Likely victory, like top school should win, but the bottom school can still win if they play better. And then a safe victory is, the top school wins safely, barring any skill gaps and major deck fails. And then one-sided, kind of self-explanatory. There's no reality for the bottom school to win one of those, barring a colossal skill gap. So as you can see, we've got more icons than there are matchups. So the idea is you only use one. You only use one of these icons per matchup. So with that being said, the first one is going to be balance versus death. And in my honest opinion, this, like, death's drains are still pretty just insane, but it's like death does need pips to combo, and with how Scales of Destiny is right now, I think it's like, I mean, it was never going to go to balance. It was never going to be a balance victory. So this this is just sort of going to sit down here and not be used. But death gets a lean victory over balance, in my honest opinion. Balance, they can bring it close usually, like Mana Burn spam and Scales of Destiny spam. It's like they're just generally good against death, but death's drains are what puts them over the line. And after the drain nerf, I would expect this match to flip in favor of the balance. But for right now, it's kind of a swing matchup. Either school could reasonably win, but death is favored by just a little bit. So next up, balance versus fire. I do think I'm going to put fire versus balance into the likely column for like giving fire the victory, because I mean fire's pierce and offensive stats is just so insane. Like fire does genuinely perform better against death, because while balance can stall out of death reasonably, a balance can't stall out of fire as much. And that's not to say that balance is completely out of the race. They can very much still beat a fire if they, burn effectively, like take good burns, that type of deal. Weakness a bunch. It's like Lore Master is also really, really good in this matchup. And that honestly does keep it out of the safe range. But yeah, fire versus balance, I'm going to give it a likely fire classification. So that's where it ends up on the tier list. Next up, balance versus ice. This is one-sided. I didn't even put the other one in. There's a file size limit, and 50 megabytes was the file size limit, so I couldn't put in all of them, so I just sort of axed some of them that were very obvious. A good balance will never, ever, ever lose to a good ice, but it's like I was saying, like ice can beat balance if there's a colossal skill gap, and you did see in my 25 Ice Games video that I did actually go 3-0 against Balance, but it was very close, and especially in Game 5 where the guy was just like using all 6 of his burns. It's like, people who play like that are why this matchup is one-sided. There is no discernible way for the Ice to win. For Balance versus Life, this is where it kind of depends. It's like if the Balance is running Tritons, then I'll give it to a lean margin, and Balance should be running Tritons because, you know, if they run a Rain Beetle pet, they obviously need Storm Accuracy, and if you have Storm Accuracy, why wouldn't you run Tritons? You know what I'm saying? So yeah, Balance versus Life, I'm gonna give it a lean Balance. Life is just, it's like Balance just doesn't really do that much burst damage, and Life is obviously a healing school, so it's really just all on the Balance to counter the heals, and if the Balance can, then the Balance can win by a little bit, and Gearhead as well is really, really good. So yeah, Balance versus Life is going to be a lean Balance victory. That's where it's going to end up on the tier list. As for Balance versus Myth, I don't know. I think I might put Myth versus Balance probably also in the likely column, favoring the Myth, because it's like Fire and Myth both. It's like these two schools are really able to get around the main things that Balance does, and that is what gives them the advantage. It's like Fire can beat Balance's shields, Myth can also beat Balance's shields because Drop Air is a thing that exists. Splash Squatch, like I showed y'all in the last PvP video on Wednesday, it's like Splash Squatch is really, really good against Balance, especially if they're spamming Scales of Destiny. So Myth versus Balance, I will give a likely margin for the Myth. So it's like between stuff like Splash Squatch, Drop Bear, and Stone Colossus, Myth is going to be taking the victory pretty handily there, as well as easier bubble control. So next up, Balance versus Storm. This, yeah, it's like Storm versus Balance. It's like when we get to Storm versus Ice, I'll talk a little bit more about how like Storm sort of gets beaten by schools that force you to play slow in most instances. So it's like Balance being a tankier school and Storm just not really being a tanky school, and Storm also needing pips to really get off their good combos. It's like Balance has a very strong edge over the Storm. It's like this is not as safe as some of the others that you'll see, but I would still call it a safe margin of victory, like maybe by 30 to 35 more games out of 100, which just barely clears that bar. So there is that. Death versus Myth. This one is very interesting. This one, it's like Myth is supposed to be Death's hard counter school, but just because it drains, it's like I've gone back and forth on these a little bit. It's like, and I wish I could have put a true toss-up tier on here, but I do think that honestly, Death is favored to win against Myth by a tilt margin, meaning like one more game out of 100. So it's like, this is a very swingy matchup, and it's like, if the Death and Myth both play perfectly, the Death should come out on top just because Wraith is nuts, but Myth can definitely get the upper hand on a Death. So yeah, that's why it'll go into the tilt margin. It's like a good Death versus a good Myth. Like I'm saying, barely goes in the Death's favor. So Death versus Storm. This is also one of those that I just don't have the Storm on, or actually I do have the Storm on top. It's down here, but this will not be getting used. Spoiler alert, this is going to be going into the safe column. This is the safest matchup out of all of the ones that I will put above the one-sided column, because it's like, one-sided, I don't want to use this too liberally. This is just for specific matchups where it is physically unwinnable. But a Storm versus a Death, it's like Death is obviously going to win like 50 to 60 more games out of 100 compared to the Storm. But the Storm can put the pressure on, and it's like that can kind of bring it close if the Storm is good and the Death is not. So yeah, it's like, again, safe margin of victory. Top school wins safely, barring a skill gap and a major deck fail. So it's like a bad Death could still, in theory, lose to a good Storm if the Storm's playing perfectly and the Death is sort of screwing up. So that's what we've got there. For the next matchup, we've got Fire versus Death, and these two are sort of like the big dogs right now. It's like Fire's really good school, Death is obviously the best, but Death, I think, it's like even though Fire is so good at putting on the pressure, it really struggles with the weaknesses. So if a Death uses their main identity being weaknesses on a Fire, it's going to like really end poorly for the Fire. So that's not to say that like a Fire can still beat a Death. It's sort of like where I rate Fire versus Ice. It's like a Fire can still eke out a win against Death if they play perfectly and the Death sort of fumbles here and there, or maybe deck fails, or just doesn't like play at their best is sort of what I'm getting at. So Death beats Fire by a likely margin, maybe 20 to 25 games out of 100 more than the Fire. So that's just where I'm at there. Life versus Fire. I think I'm going to put this in the lean column in favor of the Life Wizard. Because it's like Fire likes to go for a lot of overtimes, and Sun Serpent's getting banned. I am taking that into consideration with all of the placements where I'm putting Fire. So when Sun Serpent is banned, this, I feel like it's sort of on the border of lean and likely for the Life Wizard, but I will be keeping it in the lean column just because Fire can really pressure fast and like hard, so it's like the Life just sort of has to be on top of things, but Life does counter Fire's two main things, so that being, you know, overtimes and traps. So a Fire versus a Life, a Fire has to really go hard in the paint, like spamming Ember Everburns, maybe immolates here and there. It's like maybe the Life deck fails the Earthwalker and a Fire can get off a good Ifrit, but otherwise the match does favor Life by a little bit. It's I would say more than balance in the Life matchup and more than Death in the balance matchup, but Life does beat Fire, just not by as much. So next up is Fire versus Myth. This one's kind of contentious, I would say that. Before the Sun Serpent ban, I would say maybe here or here, but now that it is getting banned, I think I'm going to give Myth a lean victory here, just because Myth, it's like now that Myth and Fire sort of both don't have this like super high pip hit that they can just full send, they're sort of reduced to just spamming their mid pip hits, and Myths are much better than Fires. So it just sort of comes down to like who can sort of finagle the other better. It's like Sun Serpent put Fire over the top and flipped the matchup, but for when it's banned, I'm gonna say Myth is gonna beat Fire, like just like not by as much, but Myth does have the upper hand on Fire in my opinion. Next up, Fire versus Storm. This is another one, but I think that if the Fire is carrying Glacial Golem and that sort of thing, then it goes here. It's like, yeah, I mean, Glacial Golem is just sort of the big thing, keeping Fire afloat in this matchup, I will say that. And if the Fire is not carrying Glacial Golem, I would say this, maybe this, but if they are, like I was saying, it's going to go here. So Fire just has an advantage on Storm because a Fire can full pierce a Storm and then some, and then a Storm cannot full pierce a Fire. So it's like Storm kind of just can't mitigate Fire at all, whereas like, so it's basically like a pressure imbalance. Fire can pressure Storm far better than a Storm can pressure a Fire. So that's sort of where I'm getting at. Next up, Ice versus Death. In my honest opinion, I do think that Ice is favored against Death by a lean margin. It's not by much, but Ice versus Death. Ice is the only school on here that I think actually does put Death on the bottom. just a quick spoiler, but yeah, Ice, like a Death can still spam drains, and because Ice fundamentally struggles with heals, it won't be, it's like if a Death is spamming drains against an Ice, then it can be closer. And there were times in my 25 games video where that's what happened, and it started to get closer. And then Death obviously has really good pressure moves like Poison, and then just solid chat hits like Grim Reader. And Death just like sort of has all of this stuff, but Ice has the tools to beat it. And that's why it's going to be in the lean column. This is where I think a soft counter matchup should go. It's like, I think Life versus Fire and Ice versus Death, this is where they should belong, but I guess to each their own on that. So next up is Ice versus Fire, and it's like I was saying in my video, I think I'm going to put this as a likely Fire matchup, favoring the Fire. And it's like, when I was doing my 25 games on my Ice, it's like, I had 4 real games against against Fires. One of them was a PvE loss, one of them I lost to not critting, and then the other 2 I won. And then there was obviously game 24 where I lost internet, so there was that. But I do think that a good Ice can beat like a less skilled Fire, in my opinion. So that's why it's going to be in the likely tier. It's like, if a Fire isn't careful, they can lose. So that's just where it's going to go. It's like, this is really based on skill, but the Fire fundamentally is favored to beat Ice. It's just not by as much as the devs probably want. So that's where we're at on that. Life versus Ice is also going to go in the one-sided column. It's not hard to tell why. This is even more one-sided than the balance matchup. I'm going to be so for real. It's like I was just saying, Ice against Death struggles with the drain aspect of Death and Death healing, but Ice against Life, there is no discernible way to win this if the Life has even one opposable thumb on their hands. So it's like, yeah, Life is just a painful matchup to play if you're an Ice, and there is no winning. It's like, if the Ice is packing Triton, maybe it comes down here, but yeah, it's like Triton is not going to be enough. It's like a Life will out heal you, and they already have more health than you and really good resist, and you have bad pierce and bad damage, and they have better damage and pierce than you because Wiz. So yeah, Life versus Ice, one-sided. Ice versus Myth. This is going to go in the safe category, favoring the Myth. This is no surprise. Myth just absolutely trounces Ice. It's not really a secret. Myth being able to just sort of counter shields like it's nothing, and then create so much pressure with spells like Glimpse, Drop Bear, that type of deal. And then Ice obviously can't weakness them because they stone, so it's like Ice is the school of damage mitigation, Myth is the anti-damage mitigation school. So this is a very safe matchup. I would say it's maybe 40 more games out of 100 going to the Myth compared to the Ice, maybe more. And who knows, Reckonetten coming out might even lopside this even more in favor of the Myth. So who knows? Who really knows? But yeah, Myth is going to go in the safe column here against Ice. For the next one, we've got Ice versus Storm. And I do think that Ice is going to beat Storm by a likely margin just because of things like Golem and Thieving Dragon. It's like Storm, it's like where Myth can really deal with Ice's damage mitigation effectively, Storm cannot. And Storm will fall apart the moment an Ice golems. So there's that. And it used to be that a berry, like a Storm spamming berry, would put this matchup maybe here or even here on a good day. We're at the point where that's not really a factor much anymore. So yeah, Ice versus Storm, gonna go to likely Ice just because Ice is just way better at being able to mitigate Storm's damage. So that's where we're at on that matchup. Death versus Life. This is sort of on the border of safe and likely. I think Death's just overall pressuring puts this out at about like a Death plus 30 matchup out of 100. So yeah, Death, it's like a good Life can sort of stall out a Death and just like heal off if the Death is not on top of things with like heal counters and whatnot. So Life can press Death, but Death wins like by a safe margin. It's sort of on the border of likely and safe, but in my opinion, Death Death does get over that margin and gets to a 30-point margin of victory. So Death is going to beat Life like it should beat Life, but it's not going to be something like Death versus Storm, where it's just a complete wash. So there is that. Life versus Myth. I don't know. I mean, Myth is just sort of crazy with how much damage it can do, but Life just sort of has the answers to everything a Myth does. Okay, if a Myth is running heal counters, then it'll go here, but most Myths run Glimpse for, the 45 traps. So I will say that even without heal counters, this is going to go a tilt in favor of the Myth, just because Myth, it just does the damage that Life cannot, and a Myth can outdamage a Life even with healing. A Myth can do like double the damage that a Life can easily, and because Myth's resist is still high, Life's pierce is still relatively low, it's like that gives Myth the clear stat advantage as well. So Life does fundamentally counter Myth, but Myth just as a school is better than Life. So I'm going to give this a tilt Myth classification. So for the next one, we already covered Storm v Death. The next one is Storm versus Life, and I think we have finally found a matchup where Storm is favored. Maybe it's like this is it's sort of on the border here, sort of like how Death v Life was on the border of Life being safe. This is on the border of tilt and lean. I do think that Storm versus Life, it does favor the Storm by just the slightest of margins, but still over tilt, if that makes sense. But Storm being able to counter Life's heals and then also just do a lot of damage is it's sort of like that perfect storm, no pun intended. But that sort of combo together, that is where the Storm sort of takes the dub. And it's like being able to do damage against the healing school especially, and then being able to then counter that healing school, that's going to put this in the category for the Storm. The Storm is favored to win that. And it's like it's not anywhere down here because, Storm is still Storm, and Life can just goat monk a Storm to death if the Storm is not careful. So that is where we're at in terms of where the margin is at for Storm versus Life. For Storm versus Myth, and this is actually our last matchup here, without question, Myth being a shielding and resist school is, if they do the same thing that Ice does against Storm typically, it's gonna be a safe matchup. It's like a Myth can just out tank a Storm, as crazy as that sounds, and then Myth obviously being a damage and pierce school just completely steps on Storm. It's like ignoring all forms of damage mitigation against the glass cannon school that already can't take a lot of heat. That's a recipe for a safe victory. So that is the finished tier list in terms of where all of these matchups are. This is based on experience from the pre-update meta, but I've also taken into consideration things like Sun Serpent getting banned, which is why Fire is not as favored against Life and Myth. And these two matchups that they actually flipped from the pre-Serpent ban. So I am taking the new stuff into account, is sort of what I'm getting at here. So for now, this is where we are at. This is my personal opinion. This is where I think they all are. And there are 9 swing matchups, which I think is really, really good. There are 12 that are not even remotely close, but so the more skilled players should win in all 9 of these, is sort of where I'm going with this. So anyway, that is going to wrap up this tier list. Thank y'all for watching. Be sure to check out Flora on her Tumblr page and her Twitter page for the dual school symbols, if y'all are interested in that. So thank y'all for watching. I've been Ice Gold. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave like 50 comments for the algorithm. My Discord is down in the description if you want to chat with me some more, and I will see y'all later.